In 3, 2.
Hello, and welcome to South Fork Sea Farmers, Oyster Reefs, the Keystone for Bay Restoration. I am environmental journalist Alexandra Talty, and I am joined here today with Brad Peterson, Associate Professor at Stony Brook University's School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences, Greg Rivara, Aquaculture Specialist at Cornell Cooperative Extension, and Mike Dole, Associate Director for Bivalve Restoration at Stony Brook University's School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences. Thank you guys all so much for coming to join us. This is a great and exciting topic, oyster reefs. I know, oyster farming is becoming very popular on Long Island. Obviously, historically, we've had oyster reefs surrounding all of Long Island. If you guys could share a little bit about what an oyster looks like in the wild and how it grows, because I think most people are maybe more familiar with them on their plates than in the water.
Sure, I'll start. Well, oysters are bivalves, just like clams, mussels. They have 2 shells, and most of them are really delicious to eat, especially oysters. In nature, they'll form reefs, which is essentially just a large congregation of oysters. And this reef makes a 3-dimensional structure in the water that's off the bottom, that provides habitat for all sorts of different organisms. I'm sure that's something we'll talk about a lot today. A good analogy is a coral reef. Very similar, except a coral reef is built and populated by corals, and oysters are populated and built by, oyster reefs are populated and built by oysters. I think it's important to understand just the underlying basic biology of how the reef is formed, because that governs a lot of what we do, of how we restore reefs. And in nature, oysters have 2 sexes, there's males and females, and when they reproduce, they'll spawn into the water. And in the water column, the sperm will meet the egg and fertilize. And the first life stage is a larval life stage that we call a villager. Looks nothing like an oyster. And it's part of the plankton. It doesn't even live on the bottom. It's part of the plankton. So it's a microscopic larvae that swims around in the plankton. And even though it can swim, its general motions are governed by the current. So it will drift around with the currents for about 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, they'll metamorphose. And they'll want to, what we call, set and settle down onto the bottom and turn into what we know what an oyster looks like. They'll want to set on a hard surface, and then they attach. And once they attach, that's it. That's pretty much where they stay the rest of their lives. They'll use certain cues to find places, and oysters will like to set. One of their cues would be shell from other oysters. And so oysters will like to set on other oysters, and that's how a reef forms over time. So left undisturbed for hundreds of years, reefs can develop. Every generation will keep setting on the previous generations, and the structure will build up and elevate off the bottom. Also very important, elevation off the bottom, and that's essentially what an oyster reef is. And it just creates this incredible habitat for all sorts of other organisms.
So the oyster reefs were once ubiquitous across Long Island. We even see it in some of the place names of the area. How do these healthy ecosystems, how do these promote healthy ecosystems in our waters, and what are we doing now to kind of replicate that natural oyster reef?
We're building new ones. And I'll go back a step. The Baconic Bays, Baconic Gardeners Bays really never had the kind of oyster reefs like New York City did, like Chesapeake Bay, Delaware Bay. Most of the oysters there were put there by growers back starting in like the 1850s, 1880s, from the seed beds in Connecticut, from the rivers in Connecticut. And of course that went away after the brown tides was the final nail in that coffin with these large scale oyster farmers. But that doesn't mean you can't put them, and most of that bay is 15 feet deep, which is kind of deep for what we're doing, oyster reef wise. Other areas definitely had them, and of course all the tributaries, the creeks that go into the Baconics, where I do a lot of work, did have and do have oyster reefs. Matatuck Inlet has got a lot of oysters, natural oysters, and they're all over the place. So we're not putting oysters in Matatuck Inlet in South Old Town, but we're building new ones because they create habitat like crazy. And I said that last week. The whole filtering the water thing is important, but I think the habitat creation is really the number one thing why why we should do more of this compared to like a bare sand bottom.
So oyster reefs are what we call a foundation species, like corals or kelp forests or seagrass beds. And what that means is that they create themselves this foundation for other things to come and live on. And so what Greg's talking about is that lots of things are going to come and be associated with the reefs once they're in place, once they grow.
And I know you guys all probably get out and get under the water and see this kind of stuff all the time in your work. But for other people who don't have that opportunity, what are the other kind of things? Like what marine life are we seeing? What stages of life are these oyster reefs important to them in?
Well, I was working on the reefs that went into the Hudson River when they were doing their pilot studies.
Oh, wow.
And what I was involved in was looking at kind of who comes and lives on the reef and then who comes and forages on there. So you got two groups. You got those that kind of live on the reef, we'll call those the residents. And then you've got the transients that just kind of move by and forage on them, right? So on the reef, you're going to have things like little fish, little gobies, little crabs. You'll have snails that'll all live on there, worms. And the reason, well, one of the reasons is because the oysters, as they process the food or as they process the water, they're going to reject stuff. And they kind of build up this material, this organic fecal material that other things will eat. And so they'll be attracted to it. And then the transients will be the large predators that will be attracted to forage on those crabs and things that are on the reef.
Wow, I love the videos that I know both Stony Brook and Cornell put out sometimes of these. I think they're so great. And so what is the difference between seeding oysters and then building oyster reefs? Because I know in, East Hampton Town has their whole hatchery project where they seed a lot of aquaculture back out, and same as well with Cornell and Stony Brook. So when people hear reseeding versus oyster reefs, how do you kind of keep track of that?
So in aquaculture, farmers will grow oysters, so in the end you produce single oysters, right? Because that's what consumers want on their plate, a nice single oyster that's shucked open. And to do that at the hatchery stage when they're producing this oyster seed, the oyster larvae are set on what's called culch, which is microscopic pieces of shell. So each larvae sets on its own little tiny piece of shell, and it keeps the oysters individual. In nature, though, oysters will set in clusters. So they'll set on a hard surface, let's say a shell, and a lot of larvae they'll set on each other. And as they grow, they'll form they'll fuse together and form these clumps of oysters together. Not necessarily desirable for the dinner plate, but great for this habitat creation in nature. So a lot of what we do is the latter, the oyster reef building. And to do that, we will set the larvae onto shell in the hatchery, and then use that shell as building blocks to help start the reef and build the reef. And then as the oysters grow, the reef itself will grow and elevate off the bottom. I also just want to, going back to the previous with the ecosystem services, I mean, habitat is key, and that's a big reason why we do what we do. And Greg also mentioned water filtration, which is another ecosystem service. So oysters and all bivalves they're filter feeders, and they'll filter out phytoplankton out of the water. That will help improve water clarity. And with improving water clarity, light can get down further, so eelgrass beds can grow and expand. And also, as they're filtering out that algae, they're taking that algae and they're building tissue and shell. And they're sequestering nitrogen and carbon that the phytoplankton had, and they're sequestering in their tissues. I point that out from aquaculture. In aquaculture, when these oysters are harvested, that's another ecosystem service, right? So you're taking these oysters out of the water, you're taking this nitrogen and this carbon out of the water, which we call nutrient bioextraction. Really, it helps improve water quality. On the reefs, the oysters are filtering water, which will help improve water clarity. And the process of them feeding and the biodeposition that happens helps increase a process called denitrification, which also helps remove more nitrogen from the water. So those are other ecosystem services that are provided. Oysters in culture and oysters on reefs, whether it's the single oysters in culture on the reefs, they both filter water. So they're both providing that ecosystem service. And actually, in a way, they also both provide habitat too, right? Because in an aquaculture setting, the oyster cages and stuff like that provide this three-dimensional habitat used by other organisms, just like reefs do. So they both perform important ecosystem services, but a little different.
And I'll just add a couple things to that. One is that same oyster, the same species of oyster in both cases. We're really only allowed to grow one species, the eastern oyster here. Other oysters were brought into New York back in the day in the 60s when people didn't know, including scientists, didn't really realize that, that dilemma of bringing a new species in, what it could do. But there, to my knowledge, there's no remnant populations of like edulous European oyster, the flat oyster. And the other thing is that these reefs do is when they're taking that primary production, that phytoplankton, down and they're making feces and what's called pseudofeces, uneaten food. If there's a lot of food in the water, they can't handle it all, they'll actually spit some out undigested. That's why it's called pseudofeces. And what that does is it couples the pelagic production to the benthos. So worms in the ground can't get up and get that phytoplankton, but they can feed on that material that the oysters cast off.
And on that note, they make like a hot spot, right? Because that material's moving in the water column, right? It's moving around, but they eat it and they put it in one spot. And so around that reef then becomes kind of a zone of more food resources.
Okay, this is maybe a personal question. I have a hobby oyster farm, and I've noticed that like I'll get these worm like casings kind of on the bottom when I've not been the most attentive oyster farmer. Is that why? Because they're getting overloaded with nutrients?
Are they calcareous? Are they white tubes? Yeah, that's just a fouling organism. So they'll grow there no matter what. It's kind of a nuisance for growers. But they are getting some, they're also filter feeders, so they're kind of competing with their oysters actually. I'm speaking of animals that are living in the sand, in the sediment, below the bed, or interstitially, that don't filter feed.
And do you, so, obviously on the East End, oyster farming's become very popular, and it's, as we're talking about nutrient extraction, carbon drawdown, it's very positive, and another great way for people on the East End to interact with the water. Is there a conflict of interest between building these natural oyster reefs or rebuilding them and then oyster farming?
Well, Mike's done both.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, no, I don't think so, and I think they're complementary. I think aquaculture, oysters that are being farmed will also reproduce, and that's providing, and that. In that first life stage, the larvae will be dispersed away from the oyster farm and around through the estuary, and could then settle and help make reefs and help build reefs. So it's complementary that way. Looking at it from the other perspective, you might think an oyster farmer might think an oyster reef's in conflict because it might present competition, right? So, but it really doesn't. Kind of what I was saying at the beginning, like. Consumers want a single oyster on a plate. They don't want a clump of oyster like you find on the reef. So even though people will wild harvest off of reefs and break oysters apart, it's a different product that doesn't really compete with farmed oysters. So I don't really think there's a conflict between the two. And like I said, I think using aquaculture to help restoration purposes is very complementary.
I can think of two cons, two negatives possible. One is overset, because we don't have, like up in other parts of New England, especially when you have a lot of concentrated oyster farms, you'll get them, they'll spawn, but they'll stay in the estuary and they'll set on top of your market oysters. And you think, well, I'm getting free oysters. Not really, because you're going to sell them. There's going to be a little guy piggybacked on that market-sized 3-inch oyster. Not the biggest deal. It's not as bad as barnacles or your tube worms. The more important thing, I think, that could be a possibility is these beds could act as disease reservoirs, where we're leaving them out there to die of an old age, hopefully. In the meantime, they could be in dermo, and these are parasites that don't affect humans, by the way. These are diseases that do not affect human health, so let's not go there. But they do affect oyster health. And if you've got this size of this room, the studio, full of oysters, and your farm is half a mile away, they could be spitting out spores of parasites, etc., that will infect his farm. Because you don't care. I mean, it doesn't really matter. They're going to die of this disease maybe in 5 years, and you'll sell yours before they get infected, hopefully. So that's the only two negatives I can think of.
And a lot of times, you mentioned that in New England you'll see kind of wild oyster reefs around oyster farmed areas that have been in production for a long time. Are you seeing that on the East End as well with some of the more established oyster farming areas?
So recently we found, part of the Shinnecock Bay Restoration Program, recently have noticed a huge set of oysters in the Shinnecock Canal.
Oh, wow.
And the Shinnecock Canal, just when they open up the locks, it flows one way from the Peconic Estuary into Shinnecock Bay. So we're pretty sure that the source of the oyster larvae is coming from the Peconic Estuary. And really one of the main sources of oysters, I think, and tell me if I'm wrong, Greg, but is oyster farms. And so it's very interesting. So I think that's one example. I know in Great South Bay, since the ice slip aquaculture program started there, people are seeing more and more oyster sets in Great South Bay. So I think there is a lot of evidence for that happening right now on Long Island.
And just because we have all these oysters that are, tight together, and the eggs meet the sperm or vice versa, and they make these babies that float around for a few weeks, and then they set somewhere, it doesn't mean they're going to set on your reef. They could be miles away, like you said. So that's the issue, is that, I put a reef here. Let's say the town of East Hampton puts a reef here, and the larvae drift to the town of Southampton, and they make a reef in Southampton. I mean, it's all good, but why is East Hampton paying for Southampton? And this came up in the Great South Bay with the 3 towns down the South Shore with clams back in the 70s, and there were dye studies done and computer models done of the circulation, and maybe Babylon doesn't want to put a clam sanctuary here because it's going to go to ice slip waters, that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, we're talking a lot about this. How do you build an oyster reef, and do you try to build in those kind of monitoring systems to make sure that, the town of Southampton isn't paying for the town of East Hampton's oyster reef?
You guys are monitoring more than me. I mean, I'm doing some, but.
Well, why don't we talk about the building first?
Sure.
For the monitoring, and I think you're probably the best person to talk about this.
Sure. Well, Greg has been
Or
doing it.
materials.
You guys are all so polite.
We've known each other for like decades, so.
When I first started with oysters, I didn't even know this guy, but this was, I don't know if you remember, this is going back like 20 years. I would call you on the phone. I mean, we maybe barely knew each other. So I learned a lot from him at the very, very beginning. So, all right, with that said, I was sharing the love.
That's great.
So for building oyster reefs, the way we do it, the way a lot of places do it, is starting off in a hatchery, we set oyster larvae onto shell. And the shell can be packaged in different ways, okay? What we've done in the Shinnecock Bay Restoration Program and a lot of other restoration programs is we use mesh bags of shell. They can be different sizes, but we use 5 gallons of shell in a mesh bag, and it's about about a half meter long, maybe a quarter meter wide. We set the oyster larvae onto the shell, and then we grow it for about a month in tanks that we have at the hatchery. And then the little oysters will grow on the shell. We call that spat on shell, by the way, very, very important term, right? The spat on shell. So we grow this spat on shell, and then those bags of oysters basically become building blocks, right? They're like cinder blocks, living cinder blocks covered in oysters. And then you can use those living cinder blocks to build different structures in the water. And how you build that structure will depend on the environment where you're building it and what your purpose is. But you can build them in any way. One design we've done, and I know Greg has done this also, is just take these bags of spat on shell and make a rectangle. Okay, it could be whatever size you get permitted, or and then I use the analogy to a raised garden bed, right? So those are like living walls, and then inside those living walls, we put down a base of shell, and then we can plant more oysters. And sometimes we've planted aquacultured oysters in there. We hope that there'll be recruitment, which is the setting of new oysters onto the reef. So we try to put down as much shell as possible to provide that substrate for recruitment. But I think that's the basics, with creating spat on shell and then using that as building blocks.
Mike, let's go back a step though. Where's the shell coming from?
Yeah.
That's important.
Yeah. So yeah. Well, you
Again,
could take that, but
No,
yeah, but
I
it's,
mean,
yeah.
That's a big part of it, is because
Sure.
you don't just get, the shell has to be cured. If you're recycling it, like we're all doing from restaurants, you've got to let it sit for 6 months to a year to get all the meat off and let the bugs and bacteria do its work. Turn that pile, don't make the pile too deep. And then we have a shell washer, because you don't want, rain is sitting in, half the shells are cup up, right? Or the lower valve. So they're full of all kinds of crap that you don't want in your set tank. So we'll wash the shells with water and tumbling, and then put them in these bags and or crates.
Yep.
And then
And you might have seen like in the Gulf of Mexico, where they have these big barges, right, and they're just blowing shell off. And they, that wouldn't be a strategy that would work for us because we don't have enough larvae. Down there they got so much larvae that once you put the hard surface there, they'll come and recruit to that. But that wouldn't be an option for us now. That's why the spat on shell is really, the way that we would have to go here.
And when you were explaining that, so the spat on shell is kind of outside that's the rectangle shape, and then on the inside, that's just shell.
Yeah, I mean, you could do whatever. You might want to put more spat on shell in the middle too, and we've done that also. But we put a lot of shell down to create that. To create a substrate, one, so that the oysters that we put out there don't sink into the mud, because if they do, they'll perish. So you want to keep them elevated off the bottom, but also to provide the substrate for future recruitment. But yeah, you could add more spat on shell in the middle. So we're constantly, over the last 5 years, we're constantly expanding our reefs and thinking of new ways to do it, new structures. In some cases, oyster reefs are often used as shoreline protection in many areas, and I know Greg's worked on that. In that case, you might want to just do a straight line along this, parallel to the shore to create a protection for the shoreline. So really, depending on what your application is, what your goal is, and the environment you're in will dictate of how you want to go about building the reef.
On that note, we talked about ecosystem services earlier, and this would be considered one of them. With the reefs, the way that the oyster shells are, they're not like a flat barrier, kind of like an armored shore is. And so as the waves go over them, they disperse. And what that does is it decreases kind of the refraction from that. And so I work a lot on seagrasses, and grasses are known to basically kind of benefit from this oyster reef that will disperse those backwash waves.
Meaning that you're seeing kind of eelgrass or ecosystems develop like on the inside part of the oyster reef.
Right. Kind of like so if this is a shore, right, you'd have the reef, and then the wave is, I'm trying to give you a visual, right? So think of like a regular armored shoreline, and the waves come and they hit the shoreline, they refract, right? They tend to cause resuspension, and they will dig up that sediment. But if you have a oyster reef in front of that, or oyster bags in front of it, that wave will be kind of disrupted before it hits there, and the backwash will not really affect the grass that would be more of bayside, not by the wall, but bayside of that.
And then I also would imagine that all of this, we're climate crisis, climate resiliency, especially when we're talking about waves, and I think, is this a tool that scientists are looking at in terms of increasing coastal resiliency with bigger storms?
So Australia is kind of all in on this blue carbon, right, and trying to draw carbon down. And they've spent a lot of effort in looking at these living shorelines and kind of coupling them with seagrass, so kind of like you get multiple different foundation species all working together, and some of them are going to be better at keeping the carbon down, but some of them are going to protect them.
It has to be scaled though too. I mean, the bags that we're talking about, I did this in Jamaica Bay for the city of New York in 2010. It was doing great. Oyster drills were an issue, this is in not Head of Bay, but off of Arver in Queens, so on the Rockaway Peninsula, but close to Hempstead, close to Nassau County. And Hurricane Sandy came a year and a half later and just flattened it. The bags, we had a perimeter of bags like you're talking about, just shell, no spat on shell as that perimeter, surf clam shell, which is a lot cheaper and easier to get than oyster shell. And then in the center we put more surf clam shell as a base to maybe almost a half a meter high, which is pretty high, and then for around here anyway, and then a living veneer of spat on shell again on surf clam shell on top of that. And it was doing well. We had naked gobies actually spawning. I sent a video to Howard Reisman,
Nice.
my professor at Southampton College, who taught me ichthyology. And that's a mating dance for the fish, and they're all over the reef. It was incredible. And it was just gone. It's gone. So maybe concrete would have been better, or bigger bag. I don't know what, but it was a big storm, obviously.
Yeah, that's.
And how do you guys, obviously with the creation of oyster reefs, that's positive, and even though we're joking earlier about, one town kind of wanting to see the results versus another, obviously it's benefiting all of us to create these. When do you judge an oyster reef to be successful? And then if something, a 1 in 100 year storm like Sandy happens, what do you do?
All bets are off, yeah. Well, the DEC gave us a permit for this Moriches Bay reef, town of Brookhaven, and they said it's a pilot reef. It has to be under 500 square feet. So it was like 21 feet by 21 feet. We're talking English measurements, which is like nothing. To me, it was a joke. It still took a lot of shell to make, but for 5 years we have to monitor it. And they wanted that question: what is successful? After 5 years, is it successful or not? And we're in year 3 now. And I said, we want subsidence to be minimal, right? Burial, and there was a shell base there too.
What is subsidence?
When it's sinking into the sediment. Also, you can have accumulation of sediment, which is just as bad, I suppose. But we want to have 50% of the oysters surviving and see at least some recruitment. Not self-sustaining, which would be, everybody wants a self-sustaining reef. We build it and it's there forever and it's growing like a coral reef, hopefully, in some reefs down in Chesapeake,
That would be
cetera.
the ultimate success,
Right,
right?
but
Right.
it's unlikely, honestly, because of the scale of most of these projects, I think. And we're not even, water quality is off the table. We're taking temperature.
Yeah, I think success is also governed on what your goal is. So if it's shoreline protection, you might have a different metrics for that. Maybe you don't care if all the oysters live, or you have 50% survivorship, or but you have the structure there.
Well, and a dead oyster reef creates a lot of habitat too.
Sure. Yeah.
I don't want to say that, but it's true.
And one important thing that kind of picks off of a couple of things that were just discussed, and Brad, you mentioned it with areas that have high recruitment already. Your strategy for building an oyster reef could be very different. So, and you can find that on Long Island between the North Shore and the South Shore. So some areas are what we call recruitment limited, right? Because there's no source population of oysters, or very little source populations of oysters, and there's not much larvae. So the recruitment's limited. So in restoration there, if your goal is to help restore oyster populations and bring oyster populations back, you have to provide the source population, right? So we have to make the spout on shell, and we got to put out tons of oysters. Really hard. That's the case in Shinnecock Bay. There's not many oysters, and we're trying to put source populations in. Up in a lot of the North Shore bays of Long Island, there is an oyster population in Long Island Sound, and larvae are going out. Stony Brook Harbor and Mount Sinai Harbor and Northport Harbor, and all those harbors have pretty good oyster sets. Nothing like you find down south, but still, you can look around and you can find oysters on pilings, and you can find oysters everywhere. In those areas, like Brad had mentioned before, you may just want to put down shell. Just put down shell and let nature take over. And there your success might be getting recruitment, right? If you can put down shell and have oysters set on it, that could be successful. I think for our projects in Shinnecock Bay, we still consider it an experimental level. Like Greg said, we're doing very small reefs, learning a lot from it. A lot of science is going on around it. A lot of experiments, a lot of research. So we're gaining a lot of information. That's a success. So that's a measure of success right there. We've been very successful in terms of students doing projects, and really just the amount of information that we've obtained has been a success. However, we've never had recruitment. We haven't had recruitment on these reefs, okay? So they've been there for 5 years. The oysters are still surviving and doing well, and all this great stuff is happening. Eventually, the oysters are going to die. The disease or something will get them eventually, and there hasn't been any recruitment to the reefs yet. So maybe on that sense, it's not really successful, if you don't have, but it depends what your goal is and what the outcome is. So, I think for us, I would call it a success. We didn't go into this thinking we were going to immediately restore oyster populations to Shinnecock Bay, right? It's something that we're learning about, and then maybe over time we will be able to. But
I think all the fish think it's a success. And
fish think it's a success.
All the ecosystems,
Yeah.
the eelgrass. So when you were talking earlier about restaurants donating their shells, can you guys share a little more about that? And is there any way individuals can get involved with kind of the efforts to restore reefs?
I'll put a shout out for Seatuck, Half Shells for Habitat. Maureen Dunn, I guess, runs that, and it's based in Islip Town. So they do a lot in the western part of Suffolk County, and both Mike and I have gotten shell from that group, stored at Islip and Brookhaven Town transfer stations. I've been recycling for about 5 years from one restaurant in Greenport Village that I fill my pickup truck with spackle buckets. Could be 20 to 30 on a Monday, depending on the weather and the time of year for that weekend. And it's been great, and buying a lot of surf clam shell. But if you want to get involved in it, I know my colleague Kim Barber, who runs Back to the Bays, she's going to get more on this and try to get more than just that one restaurant we're dealing with, including Shelter Island and some more North Fork restaurants. So you guys got the South Fork.
But
Yeah.
in this business of restoration, shell is a hot commodity, and so I think thinking of creative ways that you could involve people or restaurants to get to shell is a good place.
And there's been a bill in Albany for years now, at least 3 sessions, that has not passed, giving restaurant owners a very small tax break for every pound or whatever of shell that they recycle through these programs. They get a penny or whatever, some money. And it's probably not amounting to much, but it's certainly a feel-good thing, and it can't hurt. And it has not been passed, so keep your eye out for that, and maybe we can all lobby for that, because like I said, it can't hurt. One of the biggest projects I did was in Jamaica Bay, another one, not the one, this is after Sandy. And it was in Head of Bay, actually in Hempstead Town, right by the airport, right by JFK. And long story short, we used a lot of surf clam shell, some oyster shell, and crushed toilets from New York City housing projects and schools, because they went to low flow. And they were stored on Staten Island, where else, to dry out. And barges from New Jersey came, got them, and brought them out. And it was a really big project with large-scale reef. And this is in an area of really functionally extinct. You worked in Jamaica Bay, I know that. And there's no oysters there to speak of, but it's very productive. It was about 20 feet of water we did this in. And in order to, we weren't going to do spat-on shell with crushed porcelain and like barge loads of shell. So we brought in about 70,000 adults and created a donor reef, floating, using these oyster grow cages that a lot of growers use. These floating cages. These are oysters that came from Cape Cod and New York. They were like this big. So they were brood stock. And we saw no recruitment either. It was a gigantic multi-million-dollar project. And it's all still there, and it created habitat, but what's successful? And it's 8-foot tide there, so it's really deep channels, and the larvae could be in the ocean.
Funny story with a toilet, because I actually tried to set last year, you might have seen it in the lab, I put a whole toilet. I replaced the toilet in my house, so I took a whole toilet,
Okay.
everything, and I put it in a 500-gallon setting tank and set oysters on it. And the vision was it would just be covered in oysters, and then I wanted to put it someplace in the bay where a lot of scuba divers go. And I just thought it would be fun, you know what I mean? And they'd go and they'd see this toilet and fish would be swimming out of it. And it didn't set that well on the toilet. And I was listening to a talk you gave last week, and you were saying how the glaze part, they don't really set well on the glaze part. You really got to crush the toilet so they can get, so this was completely glazed, and that's probably why it didn't set that well.
Maybe there's some inside you couldn't see set,
Right.
but
Yep.
if they can get in there, but that's
There was
fine.
some in, some
That's
did
fine.
go in, yeah.
So we should be throwing our unglazed toilets off of our docks
No.
Maybe just one.
for oyster reef
Maybe just one.
restoration.
Mike, I was wondering if you could kind of speak to how fast the oysters grow that you've seen in Shinnecock.
Yeah, well, I mean, it always amazes me, but they'll go from a spat, we're talking about a millimeter, after they set, maybe they're about a millimeter big, to, well over, by the end of the first growing season, to well over an inch big. And by the second year, 3 inches more. One thing, and this is, I don't really have, I have some data on it, this is more of an observation, but the growth seems to be much more, growth seems to be faster in that natural reef setting when they're growing on a reef than in an oyster cage. So oysters that we've had growing on some of our reefs are now, and they got to this point after really, I think about 3 years, 8 inches big. And I farmed oysters for 10 years. I never had an oyster grow that big in a cage, even if I had it out for that long. But
But are these rabbit ear oysters? Because you're not tumbling them, so they're growing long and skinny?
exactly, they're growing upright, long and skinny. There's no tumbling, so that's probably part of it.
So the length isn't as, the height, shell height's not as important as the volume of the oyster. And like I said, nobody wants to eat one of those, which is good for poaching.
Right,
I mean, unless
right,
you're really
right,
starving,
right,
you're not going to go try to sell them.
Right.
Yeah.
But literally the size of your hand in
That's crazy.
less than 3 years. So.
Wow, and that actually brings me to a question that I know, as we're discussing how these are so helpful for ecological systems, should people be harvesting wild oysters, or should we stick to farmed, at least on Long Island? I know in other parts of the country, the answer might be different.
I work with too many commercial fishers. to
Yeah, it's, no,
answer
it's,
that.
that's a question nobody wants to touch, right?
What about non-commercial individuals that are not commercially harvesting?
I'll start. I'm personally, wild shellfish harvesting is a part of the culture of Long Island, so it goes back, way further than farming oysters. I feel it's part of our identity as Long Islanders, and I think one of the benefits of shellfish restoration is not only the environmental benefits, but supporting the wild fishery. So a lot of the restoration now, with the Shinnecock Bay Restoration Program, we have a very large-scale effort with hard clams, and that's been going on for 10 years. And the purpose of it was to help improve water quality and increase that filtration in the bay. But a outcome of it has been 1,000% increase in the wild harvest of hard clams in Shinnecock Bay since the program started 10 years ago. So, so I think restoration. I think one of the benefits of restoration is actually supporting the wild fishery.
And I think clams, especially if you're not working the bottom, scratching those clams out, you get like basically a parking lot, really packed, and juvenile or larval clams have a hard time getting in there. So Baymen say you got to work the bottom, and I think a lot of marine scientists would agree. You got to move things around, but an oyster reef you wouldn't want to harvest from because you're going to break up. They concrete together. You wouldn't want to do that. But single oysters along the shoreline, there may be barley put there for the town of East Hampton, or we did in Southampton and Shelter Island, and other towns are doing all over, actually Nassau and Suffolk. I think that's okay.
Yeah, and I think I think restoration and the commercial fishery has to work together in that respect, because areas that you designate for an oyster reef or a spawner sanctuary is a sanctuary and should not be harvested at. But since these larvae are then transported throughout the bay, these planktonic larvae are transported to other places in the bay, that will produce areas that can be they will settle in areas that commercial fishermen can harvest from. So there has to be an agreement and a cooperation between the restoration work and the fishery work, so that the areas that are designated as sanctuaries and the sources for larvae that were produced and don't get harvested. And that's what we've achieved in Shinnecock Bay. So the town, the Southampton trustees have designated certain areas of Shinnecock Bay as sanctuaries. And even though they're not closed because of water quality, they wouldn't normally be open for fishing. And the local Baymen's Association agreed to this. And I think now, 10 years later, everybody's really happy with the decision because everybody's benefiting. The bay's benefiting, the fishermen are benefiting.
So I think maybe for folks watching at home, a good takeaway would be to, make sure that you're harvesting in certified waters, that you're not in these sanctuaries. I agree. I grew up on the East End, and clamming is a part of our culture, and all of these things. The Shinnecock obviously led the way with all of that. But yeah, having a place where maybe we're not harvesting from a reef that has just been set, or not in these sanctuary areas. And you guys do, all this information is very easily available through the towns as well as the universities. Can you guys just share a little bit about how reef development is regulated and the decision, how that kind of works between municipalities and commercial fisheries and universities? Everyone's
Another
looking
question
at
nobody
you.
wants to talk about.
Yeah.
If you're talking about permits, that's a major bugaboo because it could take you years, in plural, to get the permit, depending on the project. My favorite project we did recently was at the Shinnecock Nation, actually, on the west-facing shore, so the Ponquag Bridge is that way. And it was a big project, took sand from Shinnecock Inlet, and I work with my colleagues and the Nation's folks on staff. And my job is to do an oyster reef parallel to shore as what you're saying, a wave break. And this is centered on the Nation's cemetery, which is pretty important to protect. And the best part, no permits required, because the DEC said it's a sovereign nation. We're not going to require permits, and the trustees were cool with it. So we just did it, and that's great. Sorry. But Army Corps gets involved because you're creating a hazard to navigation, possibly, by putting those bags and building shell up. And the DEC wants to know.
And do these, so it sounds like the processes to create these can sometimes hamper the speed of creating an oyster reef.
I think so. And we were talking a little bit before this started. The hurdle was very steep 8 years ago. You know, the first, because you're kind of opening the door, right? Whenever you're new and you're opening the door, there's a lot of concern about change. And I think that as there's been more and more restoration of oysters on Long Island, it's becoming less and less new, right? And so I think that, I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying that it's, you know, it's going to take years and it's going to be, there's going to be hurdles to jump, but I don't think it's as onerous perhaps as it was maybe a decade ago.
And in all fairness to the DEC, and I work with them all the time, and I'm not talking about the shellfish folks, I'm talking about the habitat protection. So if you're going to put a bulkhead in, you got to deal with these people and get a permit from them. Those are the same people you deal with an oyster reef, depending on the depth and everything. And they consider like this table sand in the bay, and I'm going to put an oyster reef here, but the sand over there too. They consider me putting shell here, or rock, or concrete, reef balls or whatever, as habitat replacement. I'm trading one habitat for the other. And that could be a no-no because, hey, the winter flounder spawn here. And they don't spawn on rocks or shell, they're like sand. But my argument is, well, it's, you know, quarter acre, or 500 square feet, a lot less than that even. And the whole bay is sand, so that's one of the issues, which I understand. But I think we have proven, and we're doing work with the town of Brookhaven, where we have GoPro cameras every month for a tidal cycle at the reef and at a control site over there somewhere, that's sand, that was undisturbed. And it's incredible, the difference. And I didn't need to get the cameras and do all this and pay somebody to look at all the video for hours and, you know, find the fish and count them and measure them. Because I can tell you in the literature, it's very common, but every site's different, and the DEC wants to make sure that it's cool. So we're trading, I think, one habitat for another, but this shell habitat's better for most species.
And do you think that any parts of these process could be streamlined with working with these different agencies to kind of get things up and running quicker? Or, you know, given the concept of trading one habitat for another, it's maybe as streamlined as it could be?
Well, a nationwide permit would be good, like they just did for kelp.
I was thinking the same
Well, go
thing.
ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. You know, well, I think, you know, regulation's necessary. So it's easy to you know, to criticize and complain, but it's definitely, you know, it's needed because there are areas you know, restoration could create navigational hazards if it's not done in the right area. As far as trading habitats, there's habitats you don't want to lose, right? So, you know, Brad would be very upset if somebody built an oyster reef on top of an eelgrass bed, right? Brad would be very, very upset. But to Greg's point, a lot of the bottom and a lot of this work that we're doing is just sandy bottom, right? So, and it's a very small fraction of the sandy bottom. I mean, we're talking like, you know, a tiny bit. What can be done to streamline? Some type of nationwide permitting, or at least statewide permitting, that, you know, first, I think, that first says, you know, we think oyster restoration should be or oyster reef restoration is a tool in the arsenal that should be explored. That's the first thing, just a commitment saying it is a good thing, but it has to be done and give some sort of guidelines straight off the bat. Got some habitat developing over here.
Wow.
So maybe don't put it, you know, eelgrass beds, you know, off limits, navigational channels off limits, and just put this down and what areas are good, and that might streamline things, right? I don't know. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah.
I think we're evolving. You know, I think this is a continuing emerging issue that hopefully will become easier with time.
And, you know, just for people that maybe aren't as familiar with bivalves as you guys are, so why do oysters create a reef and then other ones like clams or scallops and mussels don't?
So, you know, some mussels do make reefs, but the way that Mike was talking about how they develop, you know, they set themselves on hard substrate, and they want to, you know, set themselves kind of on the hard substrate of themselves, meaning adults of them. Where the mussels, they have those byssal threads so they can move around. You know, they kind of orient themselves together, but they're not glued together, cemented together like the oysters are, so they can break up and move around. And other shellfish, like the hard clams, live within the sediment, and so they're kind of moving around, and they can, you know, kind of congregate to spawn within the sediment and then move apart. And then bay scallops, you know, they're on top. They just kind of swim around. So, you know, they're all a little bit different. Oysters have kind of a unique. although you could hear mussel reef, people could use that term because some mussels do it, right? You don't hear of like a clam reef, you know, you don't hear of a bay scallop reef, but oyster reefs are pretty common.
And you know, I'm hearing a lot about these kind of the 3D farm with oysters and kelp, and then I've heard of sea cucumbers as well being thrown into there on the Cape. How do you guys see bivalves in this kind of 3D farming, you know, pie in the eye dream? And how does that replicate maybe a natural ecosystem?
Well, I'm a big fan, but I think Mike could probably talk to it more than I could.
Yeah, and it's not just a pie in the sky thing. I mean, it's being done, and it's been done for really for decades. And you know, I think the science term that goes back, what is it? Integrated multi-trophic aquaculture.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think Brent Smith came up with a 3D ocean farming. Makes much
better.
easier. Yeah, much
better.
easier.
Okay,
But
sure.
you know, this idea of growing multiple species together, and there's a lot of benefits to that. Especially if you throw fish into the mixture, right? Because fish aquaculture could be detrimental to the environment because you feed fish more fish than you produce, right? So there's a lot of waste, and that waste can affect water quality, the surrounding water quality. Plus there's other issues. But so if you had fish and then you have filter feeders like shellfish around that to help filter out some of the particles, and then you have seaweed around that to suck up the dissolved nitrogen and everything that's being produced, you completely minimize the negative impacts caused by the fish farm. So the concept is brilliant. I mean, and doing it, and you know, so there's environmental benefit to it. There's also an economic benefit, which really, and that's what got me. I've been very involved with kelp for the last 5 years, and I got involved to it as an oyster farmer. I became interested in it as an oyster farmer, and I think especially on Long Island, right now, aquaculture on Long Island is one crop. It's oysters, it's a monoculture. So anything that affects that crop, whether it be an environmental issue, a disease, or whether it's an economic issue, you know, like markets change, maybe oysters will be out of favor, you know, at some point, or there'll be too much competition. Really, Long Island marine farmers have no other crop to fall back on. So if anything happens to the oyster industry, that's it for aquaculture on Long Island right now. So I've really been interested in this idea of diversification. How can we diversify crops? And kelp is a great complement to oysters because it has an opposite growing season. So kelp grows in the winter, and oysters grow in the warm months, and kelp grows in the cold months. So you really can shift a lot of your labor and resources from one to the other as a farmer. So yeah, the idea of 3D ocean farming and integrating different species has environmental benefits, and then it also has economic benefits to the farmer.
And do you think there's going to be, I've been hearing rumors of it starting to be work with like mussels. Are you seeing that at all?
Sure, that's being done in Connecticut right now. I mean, it's being done in a lot of places, but especially with kelp, you can put, you can suspend ropes of mussels. Mussels are usually grown on ropes that hang down in the water column. And you could put those ropes of mussels on kelp lines and literally grow them together. You know, one other interesting thing, and it's a topic of, an intense topic of research right now in our lab at Stony Brook and with Dr. Chris Gobler at Stony Brook. It's the synergies between seaweeds and shellfish when you grow them together. And seaweeds provide a lot of benefits to shellfish. You know, seaweeds can help buffer against ocean acidification because they're sucking carbon dioxide out of the water and helping to minimize, at least in the area around them, helping minimize the impacts of ocean acidification. There's some research going on in the lab by Lane Silvers that's showing how macroalgae can help. There's an interaction between macroalgae and microalgae, phytoplankton. So harmful algae blooms are a very big problem and very detrimental to shellfish farms. Growing seaweeds with the bivalves, and I won't get into the details, but can help protect the shellfish from these harmful algae blooms in several ways. There's several mechanisms that happens in. So growing them together, besides giving you an added revenue stream, it's actually can help improve your shellfish crop. Yeah, we're actually putting a paper together on that right now that will hopefully be out soon.
Exciting stuff. And you know, we don't have so much more time left, but Can individuals save their shells and donate them to you guys? Is that possible? Or are you really just interested in like restaurant donation right now, and we should support this bill in New York State?
I could take them at our Cedar Beach South Hole facility. You just dump them over the fence, and people do that. But it's a North Fork thing, and you wouldn't want to come from too far away. I know other states and counties have like shell drop-off places, usually at a transfer station, which is something we could all think of. But I don't know.
We cure shell at the Southampton campus at Stony Brook too, and so it would be possible for people to bring shell there. We had for a little bit explored, the recycling from restaurants, and we just didn't have the resources and the personnel and it's a lot of driving around, and you have to stick to a schedule, and because the restaurants will get very upset when the shell piles up and you don't come on the pickup day. So it was very difficult for us to go around. We don't have the resources to go around and pick up shell from places. But we do have a couple individuals, as well as like Haskell Seafood. He's come, he processes seafood, makes prepared dishes, but when he's doing clams or oysters, he saves them up and he brings them over and he just drops them off at the Southampton campus and dumps them off. And we've had a couple individuals call saying, hey, I have some shells. And I'm like, yeah, just bring them over. We just can't pick them up. That's the only thing. So, but yeah.
Good to know. And we have a little time left. Can you guys all share your favorite way to eat an oyster? And then we'll open to our live audience here.
So I went to school down in the South in Alabama, and there, they would wild harvest them, and we would get a bag of oysters for $70. Wow. And we'd get the grill out, and we'd lay them on the grill, we'd dunk our wet towel and stick them over the top, and just watch them until they just cracked open, and then they were delicious.
And that wet towel keeps the moisture in, I guess?
It just kind of steams them, they just kind of steam a little
Never
bit.
heard of that, yeah. I just have naked, nothing, raw.
Naked oyster, I like that.
You don't put anything on them? No.
Well, sometimes the best, yes, the favorite way.
Oh, favorite way is just raw.
Yeah.
Okay.
I hate questions with favorites because, especially with oysters, because variety, variety is what's the expression? Variety is the spice of life,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, but I have to go with Greg. I mean, I like to try an oyster first with nothing on it and just have a raw oyster and try it, and that's, I don't know. I feel that's the purest way to do it. But then, but I like to do different things. So I grilled oysters and oysters Rockefeller. I have a lot of good recipes.
How about you?
I'm also a raw oyster eater, but I think it's also when you get it like out of the water right there,
Yeah.
know.
Oh, that's the best. Yeah, right
Yeah.
from the water. Yeah.
You can taste the terroir.
Yeah.
And then does our
Merwa.
Merroir. Oh yeah, that's Kim's thing, I feel like. Does our audience have any questions?
The South Fork Sea Farmers are in the process of getting permits for our first oyster reef in Aquaculture Harbor. And something you said before about scale kind of lit up in my head, that to really get a self-sustaining oyster reef is going to be difficult given the scale that the permits allow. Can you expand on that? What scale would have a good shot at getting some sustainability?
I would say,
I have to repeat that. For the audience, the question was, the South Fork Sea Farmers are exploring setting up an oyster reef in Aquaculture Harbor, but the scale of it is an issue. What is a scale that is appropriate, and how do you kind of decide that?
I think it's what Mike said earlier. It depends on what you want to do, and self-sustaining you want to do, so the bigger the better. Just fill the whole harbor with oysters. Not going to happen. The other thing you could do, though, is also, and we didn't talk too much about this, placement. You want to get as far away from the inlet, or the outlet really is, the inlet is more important, the outlet, because that's where all the larvae are going to wind up if you put it too close with the tide. And if you want that larva retention. So you want to go up to, to the head where you can have some larva retention, and hopefully with the tide you'll get some of those larvae sticking near the adults.
Is there any natural recruitment in Aquaculture Harbor?
I don't think so. There's only some seed from the town, and there's no reef to speak of. But in keeping with the guidelines and keeping it to that 50 square feet, whatever.
500 square feet.
And keeping it close to the estuaries where they're coming into the harbor. There's 3 different areas. This is the first. If we can get 6, 2 towards each of those ends, Do you think that has a shot at replicating what you get by a larger one reef scale?
Yes. Okay, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay. So, the there's not a lot of natural recruitment in Aquaponic Harbor, and the South Fork Sea Farmers are wondering if they could set up 2 500 square meter reefs on either end of the harbor, if that would lead to more.
Yeah, you were saying there's 3 inlets coming in. I'm assuming they're fresher water, which is good. So maybe 2 at each of those 3. So 6 of these 500 square foot plus or minus oyster reefs. That would definitely help in all this. Sure, they don't have to be one big contiguous. It might be better not to be. Give some space between them, some buffer.
I think also, if the goal is to try to build a self-sustaining population, you need to think of an oyster population. I'll throw out just a fancy word. It's called metapopulation. And a metapopulation is a group of separate interconnected populations. And that's kind of what you're talking about putting these different reefs out. And they're connected, or you hope that they're connected by larval transport. So maybe one reef is producing larvae, and the currents are such that the larvae are going to get transported away from that reef. So they're not going to set on that reef, but they will set someplace else. And trying to build that metapopulation is really, that's the challenge. And that's something we're addressing with the Shinnecock Bay Restoration Program right now. Is we've built a couple reefs, but we're getting no recruitment on them. But we are seeing recruitment in the bay and other places. So where do we need to put a reef that would be the reef to capture that recruitment? An analysis of like the hydrodynamics of the bay, how currents are going, would be something to start with, to try to figure. Another thing to think about where to place reefs so that you have this interconnected population. But if the goal is a self-sustaining population, then thinking of this as a metapopulation and these separate interconnected reefs is the way to think about it. And that's how it is in nature, right? That's how it is in areas where there are natural oyster reefs and vibrant oyster populations, and they're all connected by this metapopulation concept.
And if we were able to keep all 6 of these small reefs at the same depth, hoping that then the water temperature would be the same, so the spawn would happen at the same time. Does that also make sense, and would that help?
So if they were able to create the reefs at the same time, would the spawn then happen at the same time? And then does that make it easier to create reefs?
I don't think that's necessary, actually. And maybe it's a good thing if they spawn at different times too, right? Because you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. You don't want them all to spawn during, during some sort of wind event where they're all going to get blown out of the estuary. So maybe if they spawned at different times, but I don't know if you're going to find that much variation in Aquaponic Harbor, that you're going to get that big of a temperature difference in different places that you would get that. But if you do have that in type of environment, it might be a good thing if they do spawn at different times. I don't know. What do you think?
I think having multiple ones go at different times would be
And I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has one.
Can you elaborate on the extent of historical reefs? Greg, you mentioned that Peconic and Gardners, they didn't exist, but those of us that read The Big Oyster know that Manhattan was surrounded. So how far east did natural oyster reefs occur way back in the...
Well,
Can you elaborate about natural oyster reefs and how far back they occurred and where around Long Island? We all know that they surrounded Manhattan.
Yeah, so what I said earlier was about the larger Peconic Bay, what we could say the state owned and now county control for leasing part of Peconic Bay. But there's certainly oyster reefs out to Montauk, and you know what I mean, out in Orient, in some of the tributaries, but in the main bay proper, not so much. So when we talk about, the restoration word, I hate that word sometimes, because how do we restore something that never was? Or how do we restore something that we don't know? Like I can restore my 57 Chevy, but I can't restore my 1840 house because there's no plans for that house. I don't know what happened in 1840. I can't get that wood anymore, that kind of thing. So I think the oyster reefs, and Great South Bay is a perfect example. Once it got salinized after the hurricane of '38, it became Clam City because the oysters didn't do well with the higher salinity, mainly in terms of predators.
We might, is it a short question, our next one?
Mine is.
Okay.
what about the substrate? Do oysters have to be at a hard sand bottom? Because I don't think they like mud, right? And if you're in a, like, I think about Aquabonic Harbor, I think there's some muddy areas, so do you have to build some structure to keep it off the mud?
What about the substrate? Because oysters don't like mud, and then how in places like Aquabonic Harbor would you build that if they're muddier?
Greg had mentioned earlier about this issue of subsidence, right, of them sinking down. And so Mike's usually builds a base, you know, and then puts these blocks up. And of course, the more muddy it is, the more difficult you're going to have of maintaining them up off the bottom, which is critical.
Meaning, like, otherwise they over time, like in a couple of years, my oyster reef would go from here
Right.
to there just because of the subsidence. And then can you add on top of that?
Sure, which is, you know, kind of, you know, your protocol is to build on top of the blocks that you have there, right, to get them up off the
Or at least in
bottom.
the middle, maybe on the blocks themselves, there's oysters on them, so we don't smother those. But yeah, but that central area that we build up over time. We keep building up. As the oysters grow themselves too, they're growing up. So actually, when oysters in nature, when they grow, they're not growing flat like this. They're growing up like this. So they, you know, are trying to get up away from the bottom. That's the way I look at it. You know, they're trying to get up away from the bottom.
Like a tree growing in, you know, the far, a little sapling growing up towards the sun. And as long as something's sticking up out of the mud or sand, they're alive.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, thank you guys so much for today. It's been really great learning all about oyster reefs with you. Thank you to LTV and South Fork Sea Farmers, as well as our sponsors for today, Channing Daughters.